December 23, 1943. North Africa, somewhere between Algiers and Tunis. Technical Sergeant James McKinney sits in a communications tent listening to static through worn headphones while sand blows against canvas walls and the temperature drops to 42 degrees Fahrenheit after sunset. 23 years old. 14 months overseas. Communications specialist assigned to the 36th Infantry Division. He hasn't heard a woman's voice in 117 days. The Armed Forces Radio Service broadcasts military news, battle reports, strategic updates. Voices of male announcers delivering information soldiers already know from their own experience. German forces retreating. Allied advances. Casualty figures presented as numbers without names. McKinney adjusts the dial searching for something different. Anything that doesn't remind him of the war. At 2,100 hours, through the static, a voice emerges. Female. American. Speaking directly to soldiers as if they were sitting in her living room rather than scattered across combat zones. Good evening, boys. This is Mildred Bailey, and I'm here to remind you what you're fighting for. Not propaganda. Not morale-boosting rhetoric. Just a woman talking to men who had forgotten what normal conversation sounded like. McKinney stops adjusting the dial. Other soldiers in the tent stop what they're doing. 5 men all focused on the radio listening to a voice that sounds like home. Bailey begins singing. Jazz standard, something from before the war, when music wasn't about victory or sacrifice but about human feeling. The men sit motionless. Some close their eyes. One corporal's lips move silently, forming words he remembered from another life. This wasn't the first time American soldiers heard female voices on military radio. The Armed Forces Radio Service had been broadcasting since May 1942. Women appeared occasionally, usually reading news or introducing musical programs. But something about Bailey's voice was different. The tone, the pacing, the unspoken understanding that men listening weren't heroes or warriors but exhausted human beings who wanted someone to talk to them like they still mattered as individuals. World War II transformed 16 million American men into soldiers. The transformation required breaking down civilian identity and rebuilding military identity. Drill sergeants yelled. Officers commanded. Fellow soldiers competed. Everyone reinforced the message that individuality was weakness and conformity was survival. The military machine needed interchangeable parts, not unique personalities. By 1943, soldiers had been deployed for months or years. They'd stopped thinking of themselves as individuals. They thought in terms of units, divisions, missions. Names became service numbers. Personal histories became military records. The machinery of war required this. Combat effectiveness depended on men thinking of themselves as tools serving a larger purpose. But tools don't suffer from psychological collapse. Tools don't experience what doctors called combat fatigue, or operational exhaustion, or in more honest moments, the complete disintegration of a human psyche under sustained exposure to violence and death. By late 1943, psychiatric casualties in the European and North African theaters exceeded physical casualties in some units. Men broke down not because they were weak but because they'd stopped being human and discovered that whatever they'd become couldn't sustain consciousness under combat conditions. Military psychiatrists studied the problem. They examined soldiers experiencing breakdowns. They reviewed medical records and combat reports. They interviewed commanders and medical personnel. The pattern was clear. Men who maintained some connection to their pre-war identity showed greater psychological resilience. Men who lost that connection collapsed faster and more completely. The solution seemed obvious. Help soldiers maintain civilian connections. But how? Letters from home arrived irregularly. Families wrote about problems soldiers couldn't solve and changes they couldn't understand. Reading letters often made things worse. Men would sit for hours staring at pages from people who might as well have been strangers. The distance wasn't measured in miles but in unbridgeable experience. Military chaplains tried providing spiritual connection. Some soldiers found this helpful. Most didn't. Religion required faith, and faith required belief in meaning, and meaning was hard to find in combat zones where death was random and survival depended on factors no one controlled. Chaplains were good men doing important work, but they couldn't restore what soldiers had lost. Entertainment units toured combat zones performing comedy and music. Bob Hope, Bing Crosby, Marlene Dietrich. These performances provided temporary distraction. Soldiers laughed, applauded, felt normal for an hour. Then the performers left and the war continued and nothing fundamental changed. Entertainment was like morphine. It dulled pain without healing wounds. What soldiers needed was something that didn't treat them as warriors or patients or audience members but as the men they used to be. They needed to hear voices that assumed they were still capable of normal human response. They needed someone to talk to them about things that had nothing to do with the war while acknowledging the war existed. They needed to be reminded they were human without being told they were human. December 1943. Armed Forces Radio Service Headquarters, Los Angeles. Major Edward Kirby sits in his office reviewing psychiatric reports from theater commanders. Kirby commanded AFRS programming. His job was providing radio content that supported military morale without undermining military discipline. A delicate balance. Too much entertainment and soldiers stopped taking the war seriously. Too much military content and soldiers stopped listening. The psychiatric reports troubled Kirby. The numbers were worse than he'd realized. Combat fatigue casualties exceeded 20% in some infantry units. Psychiatric evacuations from the European theater had increased 300% since June. Field commanders reported growing problems with soldiers who functioned mechanically but showed no emotional response to anything. Walking automatons who followed orders but seemed to have vacated their own bodies. Kirby had seen this personally. He'd visited the European theater in September, toured field hospitals, talked with soldiers. What struck him most was the silence. Men sat in wards or tents or dugouts, surrounded by other men, saying nothing. Not hostile silence or disciplined silence. Empty silence. The silence of people who'd forgotten how conversation worked. One soldier, a private from Ohio, had been sitting in a hospital chair for 6 days. Physically healthy. No wounds. No illness. Just sitting. Staring at nothing. Kirby had asked what happened. The private looked at him for a long moment, then said, "I can't remember what I'm supposed to be." The doctor said the private would probably recover. Probably. Some did. Some didn't. No way to predict. Kirby understood the military need for dehumanization during training and combat. You couldn't ask men to kill other men while maintaining full humanity. The mechanism required shutting down certain parts of human psychology. But Kirby also understood that mechanism had to be reversible. Men needed to shift back into human consciousness between combat actions, or they'd stay stuck in the shutdown state permanently. The question was how to facilitate that shift. Radio seemed like the obvious medium. Radio reached soldiers everywhere. Radio didn't require attention or effort. Radio could create a space where soldiers could exist as humans rather than as military personnel. But current AFRS programming wasn't achieving this. Something needed to change. Kirby studied the successful programs. Some worked better than others. Musical programs with live performances drew large audiences. News programs kept soldiers informed. Comedy shows provided temporary relief. But none of these programs helped soldiers feel human. They helped soldiers feel entertained or informed or distracted. Different thing. Then Kirby received a letter from a signal corpsman in North Africa. The corpsman described hearing Mildred Bailey on a broadcast that originated from a civilian radio station before being rebroadcast by AFRS. Bailey hadn't been performing for military audiences. She'd been doing her regular evening program, talking to civilian listeners about music and life and nothing in particular. But soldiers hearing it responded differently than they responded to military programming. The corpsman wrote, "She talked to us like we were still people." That sentence stayed with Kirby. Talked to us like we were still people. Not soldiers. Not heroes. Not warriors. People. That was the key. Soldiers needed to hear voices that treated them as if the transformation was temporary rather than permanent. As if they were still the men they used to be, just wearing uniforms and doing an unpleasant job that would eventually end. Kirby called Bailey's agent. He explained what he needed. Not a performer doing a special military show. Not someone giving patriotic speeches. Just a woman doing her regular program, talking naturally, treating soldiers like the audience consisted of normal human beings rather than military personnel. Bailey understood immediately. She'd been receiving letters from soldiers. She knew what they needed. January 4, 1944. Mildred Bailey's first Armed Forces radio service program broadcasts at 2,000 hours across all military frequencies in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. 43 minutes of music, conversation, and Bailey's voice speaking as if she were sitting in a room with friends rather than broadcasting to millions of soldiers scattered across combat zones worldwide. No mention of the war. No patriotic appeals. No morale-boosting rhetoric. Bailey talks about music, the artists she knows, funny incidents from recording sessions, small observations about life. She introduces songs by explaining what she loves about them rather than presenting them as entertainment for troops. She pauses between songs to make quiet observations that assume listeners are capable of understanding nuance and complexity. In a dugout near Anzio, Private Thomas Morrison listens with his squad. They'd been under artillery bombardment for 6 hours. The shelling stopped at 1900. They have 1 hour before it starts again. Morrison twists the radio dial and finds Bailey's voice. The squad goes quiet. 11 men listening to a woman talk about Billie Holiday's phrasing technique. Bailey isn't trying to make them feel better. She's not acknowledging they're in danger. She's treating them as if they're music enthusiasts who'd be interested in how Holiday breathes between phrases. As if their current situation is temporary and their actual identity as people who care about music is permanent. The assumption does something to Morrison's mind. Makes him remember he used to care about things like phrasing technique. Makes him feel like that person still exists somewhere underneath the soldier. On a Navy destroyer in the Pacific, Seaman Harold Webster hears Bailey through the ship's communication system. Webster has been at sea for 11 months. He hasn't touched land since February 1943. The ocean is endless and empty, and Webster has started feeling like the emptiness is inside him too. Bailey talks about her garden in California, how the roses are blooming in January because California weather makes no sense. Small detail. Meaningless in strategic terms. But Webster remembers his mother's garden in Pennsylvania. Remembers roses blooming in June. Remembers being a person who noticed flowers. The response is immediate and overwhelming. Soldiers write letters. Thousands of letters. Not fan mail. Something different. Letters from men trying to explain what Bailey's program does to their consciousness. Most struggle to articulate it. They use phrases like, makes me feel normal, or reminds me of home, or helps me remember. Some are more specific. A corporal from Kansas writes, when I hear her voice I can feel myself coming back. Like parts of my mind that had shut down start working again. Military psychiatrists noticed the pattern too. Soldiers who listen to Bailey's program show measurably improved psychological resilience. They sleep better. They communicate more with fellow soldiers. They show emotional responses to situations rather than mechanical compliance. The effect isn't dramatic or immediate, but it's consistent. Regular listeners maintain more stable mental states than non-listeners. February 1944. Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. Second Lieutenant Sarah Dowling sits in the officers' lounge reading psychiatric reports from the European theater while preparing for deployment to England as a military nurse. 26 years old. Nursing degree from Columbia. 3 months of military training. She'd volunteered because newspapers said nurses were needed and because sitting safely in New York while men died overseas felt wrong. The reports describe psychiatric casualties with the same clinical detachment as physical wounds. Combat fatigue. Operational exhaustion. Conversion disorders. The language was medical, but the reality was men breaking down mentally under conditions their psychology couldn't process. Dowling had treated psychiatric patients during nursing school. She understood the conditions described. What troubled her was the scale. 30% psychiatric casualties in some units. 30%. The reports also mentioned Bailey's radio program. Multiple psychiatric officers noted the correlation between regular listening and psychological stability. The data wasn't rigorous. No controlled studies. Just observations from doctors treating patients. But the pattern was consistent enough that theater commanders were ordering communication officers to ensure Bailey's program reached all forward units. Dowling found this interesting. She'd heard Bailey before the war. Jazz singer, known for her phrasing and emotional depth. But Dowling hadn't considered Bailey's voice as a therapeutic tool. Now psychiatrists were describing it as one of the most effective interventions available for preventing psychological collapse in combat personnel. March 1944. Dowling arrives in England. She's assigned to the 128th General Hospital near Oxford. The hospital treats wounded soldiers evacuated from combat zones before sending them back to duty or transferring them to facilities in the United States. Most patients have physical wounds. Some have psychiatric conditions. Dowling works in a ward treating both. The patients with physical wounds heal predictably. Antibiotics, surgery, rest, physical therapy. Medicine could fix broken bodies. The patients with psychiatric wounds were different. Some recovered quickly. Others didn't. The unpredictability frustrated Dowling. Two soldiers experiencing identical trauma responses would show completely different recovery trajectories. She couldn't identify the determining factor. On March 18th, Dowling notices something. The psychiatric ward has a radio. Patients listen to armed forces radio throughout the day. Most programs generate minimal interest. Men listen passively, staring at walls or windows. But when Bailey's program broadcasts, patients change. They sit up. They focus. Their faces show expression. Some talk to each other after the program ends, discussing music or making small observations. Brief conversations that stop after a few exchanges, but conversations nonetheless. Dowling mentions this to the ward psychiatrist, Captain Edmund Greene. Greene had already noticed. He'd been tracking patient responses to different radio programs for 6 weeks. Bailey's program produced the most consistent positive effect. Greene didn't understand why. The content wasn't therapeutic. Bailey wasn't providing counseling or guidance. She was just talking about music and life. But patients responded as if the program was medicine. Greene asks Dowling to observe specific patients during Bailey's next broadcast. Document their behavior before, during, and after. Note any changes in affect, communication, or physical demeanor. Dowling agrees. On March 20th, she positions herself in the ward at 1945 hours, 15 minutes before Bailey's program begins. The ward contains 22 patients. 15 with physical wounds, 7 with psychiatric conditions. Before the broadcast, the ward is quiet. Patients lie in beds or sit in chairs. Some read. Some stare. No conversation. When Bailey's voice begins, 11 patients turn toward the radio. Move their chairs closer. 2 psychiatric patients, previously nonverbal, begin mouthing words along with Bailey singing. During the program, Dowling notes changes. Patient's breathing slows. Facial muscles relax. Two men close their eyes, but not in the vacant way they usually do. They're listening, processing, feeling something. After the program ends, 5 patients initiate conversation with others nearby. Topics are trivial. Did you hear how she phrased that line? I saw her perform in New York before the war. But the act of initiating social interaction marks significant change for men who'd been psychologically isolated for weeks. Dowling writes a detailed report. Greene reviews it and adds his own observations. They submit the report through medical channels to theater command. The response comes from Colonel William Porter, chief psychiatrist for the European theater. Porter had been tracking Bailey's effect across multiple hospitals. He requests formal study. Greene and Dowling will document patient responses over 3 months, comparing recovery rates between regular listeners and non-listeners. The study begins April 1st. Greene and Dowling create 2 matched groups. Each contains 30 psychiatric patients with similar diagnoses and similar length of hospitalization. One group has access to radio during Bailey's program. The other group doesn't. Both groups receive identical medical treatment otherwise. The goal is isolating Bailey's specific effect. By April 30th, preliminary results show measurable difference. Patients in the listening group demonstrate faster recovery across multiple metrics. They sleep better, participate more in therapy, communicate more with staff and other patients. The difference isn't dramatic. Recovery rates improve by approximately 15%. But in psychiatric medicine, 15% improvement from a radio program represents significant effect. Dowling begins interviewing patients about Bailey's program. She asks what they're experiencing when they listen. Most struggle to explain. A private from Ohio says, "She makes me remember I used to be a person." A sergeant from California says, "When I hear her voice, I can feel something inside me that I thought was gone." A corporal from Texas says, "She talks to me like I'm still human." That word appears repeatedly. Human. Patients describe Bailey's program as making them feel human again. Dowling tries to understand what they mean. Being human versus being what? A soldier? A patient? A number? The patients can't articulate the distinction clearly. They just know Bailey's voice helps them access some part of themselves they'd lost. Greene develops a theory. Combat requires shutting down emotional processing. Soldiers can't function effectively if they're feeling full human response to violence and death. The military trains this shutdown deliberately. But the shutdown mechanism doesn't discriminate. When you shut down negative emotional processing, you shut down all emotional processing. Soldiers lose access to positive feelings too. Joy, humor, connection, aesthetic appreciation. Everything goes offline. Bailey's program doesn't force emotional response. She's not trying to make soldiers feel better. She's treating them as if they're already capable of normal emotional response. As if the shutdown is temporary rather than permanent. That assumption creates psychological space for soldiers to test whether they can still feel things. Some can. Some can't yet. But the space for testing has to exist before recovery can begin. May 1944. The formal study expands to 8 hospitals across England and North Africa. Each hospital creates matched groups of psychiatric patients. Half listen to Bailey's program. Half don't. All receive standard psychiatric treatment. The data collection is rigorous. Multiple observers document patient behavior. Recovery is measured using standardized assessments. By June, the pattern is undeniable. Bailey's program produces consistent positive effect on psychiatric patients. The effect size varies. Some patients improve dramatically. Some improve slightly. But average recovery rate is 18% faster for listening groups versus non-listening groups. The finding is statistically significant and clinically meaningful. Greene and Dowling write a comprehensive report. They detail methodology, present data, discuss implications. They conclude that Bailey's program should be considered a standard intervention for combat fatigue and operational exhaustion. Not a replacement for medical treatment, but a supplement that enhances treatment effectiveness. Theater Command approves. Bailey's program is officially designated as therapeutic programming. July 1944. Bailey receives notification that her program is now considered medical treatment. The information comes with a request. Would she be willing to do additional specialized programs specifically for psychiatric patients? Programs that could be broadcast in hospital wards during therapy sessions? Bailey agrees but requests guidelines. What should these specialized programs contain? What should she avoid? The psychiatrists send detailed recommendations. Keep the same conversational tone. Keep treating listeners as normal people. Don't acknowledge their psychiatric conditions. Don't offer therapy or counseling. Just talk about music and life. The therapeutic effect comes from normalcy, not from attempting to heal. Bailey creates the first specialized program on July 15th. It's identical to her regular program except for one difference. She talks slightly more slowly and pauses slightly more often between songs. The pacing gives listeners more time to process what they're hearing. Everything else remains the same. Music, conversation, small observations about life. Nothing that signals this is medical programming. Hospitals begin using the specialized programs during therapy sessions. Psychiatrists play the recordings while working with patients. The program provides structure for therapeutic conversation. Doctor and patient listen together. Then the doctor asks what the patient heard, what they felt, what they noticed. The program gives patients permission to discuss feelings without feeling pressured to perform emotion they're not yet capable of experiencing. Results continue to improve. By August, recovery rates for psychiatric patients in listening programs are 23% faster than non-listening programs. But the more significant finding is recidivism. Soldiers treated with Bailey's program show lower rates of psychiatric breakdown when they return to duty. Something about the program teaches them how to maintain access to human feeling while functioning as soldiers. Greene publishes his findings in the Journal of Military Medicine. The article describes Bailey's effect and recommends widespread implementation. Other psychiatrists replicate the study. Results are consistent. Bailey's voice produces measurable therapeutic effect on combat-related psychiatric conditions. The mechanism remains unclear, but the outcome is undeniable. September 1944. Armed Forces Radio expands Bailey's programming. She now broadcasts 4 times weekly instead of twice. Each broadcast reaches 8 million soldiers worldwide. Letters continue arriving. Thousands per week. Soldiers write describing what the program means to them. Most letters are short. A few sentences thanking Bailey for her voice. Some are longer. Men attempting to explain what happens to their consciousness when they listen. One letter, from a corporal in France, describes the experience precisely. When I hear your voice, I remember I used to be someone. Not a soldier, not a casualty, not a number. A person with thoughts and feelings and preferences. The war tries to erase that. Your voice reminds me it's still there. That's the most important thing anyone has done for me since I put on this uniform. Bailey keeps every letter. She reads them between broadcasts. She tries to understand what soldiers are telling her. They're not describing entertainment. They're describing a lifeline. Her voice was the only thing connecting them to their pre-war identity. Without that connection, they'd be lost permanently. The responsibility is overwhelming. Bailey feels the weight of 8 million soldiers depending on her voice to stay human. But she also feels something else. Pride. Not pride in fame or success. Pride in being useful. In doing something that matters in measurable ways. In helping men survive not just physically but psychologically. In keeping them human through the most dehumanizing experience possible. That's worth the pressure. October 1944. Private Michael Romano sits in a foxhole near Aachen, Germany, listening to shelling through the darkness while holding a portable radio pressed against his ear. 19 years old. 5 weeks in combat. 1st Division, 16th Infantry Regiment. He's been under fire for 11 of the last 14 days. His platoon started with 43 men. Now it has 19. The others are dead, wounded, or missing. Romano hasn't slept more than 2 hours continuously in 3 weeks. When he closes his eyes, he sees the same images. Bodies. Blood. Faces of men who were alive yesterday. His hands shake constantly. Not from cold. From something else. Something that makes him feel like his consciousness is separating from his body. Like he's watching himself from outside, seeing a scared boy in a uniform who doesn't understand why he's still alive. At 2000 hours, Bailey's voice comes through the radio. Romano almost changes the channel. He doesn't want music. He doesn't want conversation. He wants to stop feeling anything. But his fingers are shaking too badly to turn the dial. So he listens. Bailey talks about recording a new album. She describes the studio in Los Angeles, the musician she's working with, a piano player who keeps making jokes between takes. Small details from a world that feels fictional. Something in Romano's chest loosens. Not dramatically. Just slightly. Enough that he can breathe more deeply. He closes his eyes and for 2 minutes doesn't see bodies. He sees the recording studio Bailey described. He hears the piano player's jokes. He imagines himself sitting in the control room watching the session. The image isn't real, but it's also not the war. That makes it valuable. When Bailey's program ends, Romano feels different. Still scared. Still exhausted. Still shaking. But less like he's watching himself from outside. More like he's inhabiting his own body again. He doesn't understand why Bailey's voice has this effect. He just knows it does. He adjusts his position in the foxhole and waits for dawn. Across Germany, France, Belgium, and Holland, similar moments are occurring. Soldiers in foxholes, trenches, bunkers, and field hospitals listen to Bailey's program and feel something shift in their consciousness. Not healing. Not comfort. Just a brief reminder that they used to be people and might be people again when the war ends. Captain Richard Morrison commands an infantry company in the 101st Airborne. His company participated in Market Garden. They jumped into Holland in September, fought through October, sustained 60% casualties. Morrison has been in combat since Normandy. 6 months of continuous fighting. He's 29 years old but looks 45. His hair has started graying. His face has deep lines that weren't there in June. Morrison notices Bailey's effect on his men. Before her program, morale is low. Men are quiet, withdrawn, functioning mechanically. During and after her program they talk more. They make small jokes. They show facial expressions. The change lasts about an hour. Then they revert to mechanical functioning. But that hour matters. It proves they're still capable of being human. That's important information for men who've started believing they're permanently broken. Morrison writes to Division Command requesting additional radios for his company. He explains that Bailey's program provides measurable morale benefit. Command approves the request. Romano's company receives 3 new radios in November. Morrison ensures every platoon has access to Bailey's broadcast. He notes the results in his daily reports. Psychological stability improves. Psychiatric casualties decrease. Men function more effectively in combat. The data from Morrison's company joins data from hundreds of other units across the European theater. By December 1944, Army psychiatrists have documented Bailey's effect in 147 separate units. The pattern is consistent. Regular exposure to Bailey's program correlates with improved psychological resilience, reduced psychiatric casualties, and better combat performance. The correlation is strong enough that some commanders make listening to Bailey's program a mandatory activity. Navy psychiatrists report similar findings. Sailors on extended deployments show improved mental health when they have regular access to Bailey's program. The effect is particularly strong among submarine crews. Submarines are confined spaces where men experience extreme psychological pressure for weeks or months without relief. Bailey's voice provides brief escape from the confinement. Not physical escape. Psychological escape. A few minutes where men can remember they exist as individuals rather than as components of a submarine crew. On the submarine USS Barb, operating in the Pacific, Chief Petty Officer James Ward maintains the communication system. The crew listens to Bailey's program every time it broadcasts. Ward notices that discipline problems decrease during periods when the program is available. Men fight less. They cooperate more. They show more respect for each other. Ward reports this to the captain. The captain notes it in his log. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. December 1944. Battle of the Bulge. German forces launch surprise attack through the Ardennes. American units are scattered, surrounded, fighting in brutal winter conditions. Communication is difficult. Supply lines are cut. Men are isolated in frozen forests facing overwhelming enemy forces. Psychological pressure is extreme. Some units experience complete psychological collapse. Men stop fighting, stop responding to orders, sit motionless in the snow. In a farmhouse near Bastogne, Sergeant William Patterson huddles with 9 men from his scattered unit. They've been cut off from their company for 3 days. They have minimal ammunition, no food, frozen feet. Patterson has been trying to maintain discipline, but the men are breaking down. 2 have stopped speaking. 1 sits motionless staring at nothing. Patterson doesn't know how to help them. At 2000 hours, someone turns on a portable radio. Bailey's voice comes through static and interference. The program is barely audible, but it's there. The men go quiet. Even the ones who'd stopped responding to external stimuli turn toward the sound. Bailey talks about Christmas in California. She describes going to the beach on Christmas morning, how strange it feels to celebrate winter holidays in warm weather. She plays Christmas songs arranged in jazz style. Patterson watches his men listen. He sees their faces change. Muscles relax. Breathing slows. 2 men who haven't spoken in 48 hours start humming along with the music. The effect lasts throughout the program. When it ends, the men are still exhausted, still scared, still facing overwhelming odds. But they're present in their own bodies again. They can think. They can respond. They can function. Patterson's unit holds their position for 2 more days until relief arrives. Later, Patterson writes in his report that Bailey's program prevented complete psychological collapse. Without it, several men would have required psychiatric evacuation. With it, they maintained enough mental stability to keep fighting. Patterson recommends Bailey receive formal recognition for her contribution to military morale and psychological resilience. January 1945. Armed Forces Radio compiles data on Bailey's program. The numbers are extraordinary. 8.3 million regular listeners. 12,000 letters per week. Formal recommendations for recognition from 37 unit commanders. Documented correlation with improved psychological outcomes in 200-plus separate units. Bailey's program has become one of the most effective morale tools available to the military. Not because it entertains soldiers. Because it keeps them human. But Bailey herself is struggling. The pressure of knowing millions of soldiers depend on her voice is overwhelming. She broadcasts 4 times weekly. Each broadcast requires several hours of preparation. Between broadcasts, she reads letters from soldiers. Thousands of letters describing psychological suffering, asking for help, thanking her for being the only thing keeping them connected to their humanity. The responsibility is crushing. Bailey develops insomnia. She lies awake at night thinking about soldiers in combat zones listening to her voice. She imagines them in foxholes, in trenches, in hospitals. She wonders if her voice is reaching them. She worries about the ones who aren't listening, the ones who are breaking down without any connection to remind them they're human. The worry eats at her constantly. February 1945. Bailey's physician recommends rest. She's experiencing symptoms of exhaustion and stress. But Bailey refuses to reduce her broadcast schedule. She explains that soldiers need the program. They've written telling her it's the only thing keeping them psychologically stable. She can't stop broadcasting while the war continues. The doctor argues that if she collapses from exhaustion, she won't be able to broadcast at all. Bailey acknowledges the logic but doesn't change her schedule. March 1945. Allied forces cross the Rhine. The end of the European war is approaching. Soldiers can see it. They know they might survive. This creates new psychological pressure. Men who'd been functioning mechanically start feeling emotions again. The feelings are overwhelming. Fear, grief, rage, guilt. All the emotions they'd shut down to survive combat come flooding back. Psychiatric casualties increase. Bailey's program becomes even more important. Men need her voice now more than ever. Not to shut down feelings but to process them. Bailey starts talking more explicitly about emotion in her broadcasts. Not about the war. About music and emotion. She discusses how jazz musicians express feeling through sound. How phrasing and timing convey things words can't say. She gives soldiers language to think about their own emotions without having to articulate them directly. The effect is immediate. Soldiers write describing how Bailey's discussions of musical emotion help them understand their own psychological state. A lieutenant in the Third Army writes, "When you talked about how musicians use silence between notes to create tension and release, I understood what I'm feeling. The silence between combat actions is where all the emotion lives. Your voice helps me sit with that silence instead of being destroyed by it." April 1945. Germany surrenders. The European war ends. Soldiers who've been fighting for months or years can finally stop. But stopping is harder than fighting. When combat ends, all the psychological mechanisms men used to survive stop being useful. The shutdown of emotion that kept them functioning becomes a prison. Men can't feel relief, can't feel joy, can't feel anything. They sit in displaced persons camps and occupied German towns, physically safe but psychologically shattered. Bailey's program shifts to address this. She talks about coming home, about readjusting to civilian life, about the difficulty of returning to normal existence after experiencing things most people can't imagine. She doesn't pretend it will be easy. She doesn't offer false comfort. She just acknowledges the difficulty and treats soldiers like they're capable of handling it. Like they're still the men they used to be, just carrying heavier weight. May 1945. Private Romano, the soldier who listened in the foxhole near Aachen, is now stationed in Frankfurt. The war is over. He survived. He doesn't understand how. Most of his original platoon is dead. He should be dead too. The fact that he isn't feels wrong. He sits in his barracks thinking about this constantly. Guilt about survival. Confusion about why he's alive when better men died. On May 12th, Bailey broadcasts a program about survivor's guilt. She doesn't call it that. She talks about a musician friend who survived a car accident that killed 2 bandmates. She describes his struggle to understand why he lived. She doesn't offer answers. She just acknowledges the feeling and says it's normal. Romano listens and feels something break inside him. Not breaking down. Breaking open. He starts crying. First time since before the war. He cries for 20 minutes. When he stops, he feels lighter. June 1945. Troops begin rotating home. Ships carry soldiers across the Atlantic back to the United States. The voyage takes 10 to 14 days. Men have nothing to do but wait and think. Thinking is dangerous. Without combat to occupy their consciousness, memories flood in. Men relive battles in their minds. They see faces of dead friends. They feel fear and rage and grief they'd suppressed for months or years. Some break down completely. Ships' captains request that Bailey's program be broadcast throughout the voyage. The request is approved. Every troop transport ship carries recordings of Bailey's programs. The recordings play twice daily during the Atlantic crossing. Soldiers gather around speakers and listen. Bailey's voice provides structure for the transition from combat consciousness to civilian consciousness. She helps men remember how to be human during the days when remembering is hardest. July 1945. The Pacific War continues. Soldiers in the Pacific Theater face the prospect of invading Japan. Casualties are expected to be catastrophic. Psychological pressure is immense. Bailey's program reaches Pacific forces through Armed Forces Radio. The effect is the same as in Europe. Men listen and feel connected to their humanity. They remember they used to be people and might be people again if they survive. In August, atomic bombs end the Pacific War. Suddenly, unexpectedly, all combat stops. Soldiers who'd been preparing to die in the invasion of Japan are safe. The relief is overwhelming. But so is the psychological aftermath. Men break down in massive numbers. Psychiatric casualties in August 1945 exceed combat casualties in some Pacific units. The war is over, but the cost of survival is becoming clear. Bailey's program runs continuously through September, October, November. As troops rotate home, as men attempt to return to civilian life, as the psychological cost of war becomes undeniable, Bailey's voice remains constant. She keeps broadcasting, keeps talking to soldiers like they're human, keeps reminding them that their wartime transformation was temporary and they're still the men they used to be, just changed by experience they'll carry forever. December 1945. Oakland Army Base, California. Former Technical Sergeant James McKinney stands in a processing line waiting for discharge papers. 25 years old. 3 years of service. He'd enlisted in December 1942. Now he's going home. Back to Michigan, back to civilian life, back to being Jim instead of Sergeant McKinney. He doesn't know how to do that. Doesn't know if the person he used to be still exists. A radio plays in the waiting area. Armed Forces Radio, still broadcasting to troops awaiting discharge. At 1,400 hours, Bailey's voice comes through the speakers. McKinney stops moving. He listens. Bailey talks about the end of the war, about soldiers coming home, about the difficulty of transition. She says something that makes McKinney's throat tighten. You're not the same person you were when you left. You can't be. But you're still you. The war changed you, but it didn't erase you. That person you remember is still there. You just have to give yourself permission to be him again. McKinney realizes he's crying. He's standing in a processing line at an army base crying while listening to a radio program. Other men near him are crying too. No one speaks. They just stand there, listening, feeling something break inside them. Not breaking down. Breaking free. Bailey's voice giving them permission to stop being soldiers and start being themselves again. The final broadcast of Bailey's military program airs on February 28, 1946. By then, most soldiers have been discharged. The program has been running for 25 months. 104 broadcasts total. An estimated 12 million different soldiers listened at various times. Letters to Bailey exceed 200,000. Military psychiatrists documented the program's effect in over 400 separate studies. The findings are unanimous. Bailey's voice provided measurable psychological benefit to soldiers experiencing combat-related stress and trauma. But numbers don't capture what Bailey's program actually accomplished. The real impact exists in moments that were never documented, in soldiers who maintained psychological stability because they heard a voice that treated them as human, in men who remembered they had identities beyond their uniforms because someone spoke to them as if they still existed as individuals. Private Romano, who listened in the foxhole near Aachen, returns to Philadelphia in March 1946. He struggles with adjustment. Can't sleep. Can't hold a job. Feels disconnected from everyone around him. His family doesn't understand. His friends don't understand. No one can comprehend what he experienced. He starts thinking he's broken permanently. That the war destroyed some fundamental part of him that can't be repaired. In June, Romano is walking past a record store. Through the window he hears Bailey's voice. She's not doing her military program anymore. She's returned to civilian broadcasting. But the voice is the same. Romano stops walking. He stands outside the record store listening. Bailey talks about jazz, about music, about life. The same conversational tone she used during the war. Treating listeners like people who matter. Something in Romano's chest loosens. He remembers hearing that voice in Germany while shells exploded around him. Remembers how it made him feel human. He realizes the feeling is still available. He's not permanently broken. He's just carrying weight that makes it hard to feel anything else. Bailey's voice reminds him the feeling is still there, buried under the weight but not destroyed. He can access it if he gives himself permission. Romano enters the record store. He buys every Bailey record they have. He goes home and plays them repeatedly. He uses her voice the same way he used it during the war. As a reminder that he's still human. As permission to feel things. As evidence that the transformation wasn't permanent. Over months, with help from Bailey's voice and from therapy and from time, Romano begins to reclaim his civilian identity. Never completely. The war left permanent marks. But enough that he can function, can work, can have relationships, can be Jim instead of Private Romano. Thousands of veterans have similar experiences. They hear Bailey's voice after the war and remember what it meant during the war. They use her music as a tool for psychological recovery. They write to her describing this. Bailey keeps the letters. She understands now what her program accomplished. It wasn't entertainment. It was medicine. She provided something military psychiatrists couldn't provide. Not treatment but space for healing. Permission to be human while wearing a uniform. Recognition that the transformation was temporary and reversible. 1947. Military psychiatrists begin publishing comprehensive analyses of Bailey's program. The studies examine her effect across multiple metrics: psychiatric casualty rates, recovery times, recidivism rates, post-discharge adjustment. The findings are consistent. Regular exposure to Bailey's program correlated with better outcomes across all measures. The effect size was modest but statistically significant and clinically meaningful. The mechanism of action was less clear. Bailey wasn't providing therapy. She wasn't attempting to heal trauma. She was just talking to soldiers like they were people. But that simple act produced measurable psychological benefit. Psychiatrists theorized that Bailey's voice created cognitive space for soldiers to maintain connection to their pre-war identity. That connection served as an anchor preventing complete psychological disintegration under combat stress. Further analysis suggested Bailey's effect operated through multiple pathways. Her voice provided distraction from immediate stress. It activated memories of pre-war life. It demonstrated that normal human interaction was still possible. It gave soldiers practice at experiencing emotion in a controlled way. All these mechanisms combined to enhance psychological resilience and facilitate recovery from combat-related trauma. The findings influenced military psychiatry for decades. The concept of using media to support psychological resilience became standard practice. During the Korean War, the military deliberately incorporated programming designed to help soldiers maintain connection to civilian identity. During Vietnam, similar programs attempted to replicate Bailey's effect. The success rate varied, but the principle remained constant. Soldiers need reminders that they're human, and voices that treat them as human can provide those reminders. Bailey herself never fully grasped the magnitude of her contribution. She knew the program mattered. She read the letters. She understood soldiers found her voice helpful. But she didn't see herself as a psychological intervention. She was just a singer who talked to soldiers because they seemed lonely and because no one else was talking to them like they were still people. In 1951, Bailey was diagnosed with diabetes. Her health declined gradually through the 1950s. She continued performing but reduced her schedule. She never resumed the intensive broadcast schedule she'd maintained during the war. The pressure had taken its toll. She'd given everything she had to keeping soldiers human, and the effort had exhausted her permanently. December 12, 1951. Bailey dies at age 44. Her obituaries focus on her musical career. Jazz singer, recording artist, radio personality. Some mention her wartime broadcasts but most don't. The cultural memory of her contribution fades quickly. By the 1960s, most Americans had forgotten Bailey existed. Her music remained in jazz archives, but her wartime program disappeared from historical consciousness. But veterans remembered. Men who'd listened to her voice in foxholes, in hospitals, in transport ships carried that memory for decades. They remembered how her voice had kept them human when humanity felt impossible. They told their children and grandchildren about hearing Bailey's voice through the static while shells exploded around them. The stories were personal, not historical. Family memories rather than official records. 1991. A military historian named David Preston researches World War II psychological support programs. He discovers references to Bailey's radio program in archived psychiatric reports. The references are frequent and detailed. Psychiatrists described Bailey's effect as one of the most significant morale interventions of the war. Preston is surprised. He's never heard of Bailey. Her program isn't mentioned in standard World War II histories. Preston begins collecting documents. Psychiatric reports, unit histories, personal letters, military correspondence. The evidence is overwhelming. Bailey's program had been crucial to maintaining military morale and psychological resilience across all theaters. Yet she'd been completely forgotten by official history. Preston writes an article for the Journal of Military History documenting Bailey's contribution. The article is published in 1993. The article generates renewed interest. Other historians begin researching Bailey. They discover the letters, the psychiatric studies, the documentation of her effect. They interview surviving veterans. Every veteran who'd listened to Bailey's program remembered it. They described her voice as essential to their survival. Not physical survival, psychological survival. Bailey had kept them human when the war tried to erase their humanity. 2003. The Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress begins collecting oral histories from World War II veterans. Interviewers notice a pattern. Veterans frequently mention Bailey's radio program. They describe it as one of the most important morale factors during the war. The interviews are recorded, transcribed, archived. Bailey's contribution enters the historical record properly for the first time. 2011. Military psychologists studying resilience in Iraq and Afghanistan veterans discover Preston's 1993 article. They become interested in Bailey's program as a model for supporting psychological health in deployed troops. They analyze the documented effects and attempt to identify replicable elements. The analysis yields useful insights about the relationship between identity maintenance and psychological resilience under stress. The military implements new programming based partially on Bailey's model. Radio programs and podcasts designed to help deployed troops maintain connection to civilian identity. The programs aren't identical to Bailey's, but they operate on the same principle. Treat soldiers like they're still the people they used to be. Give them permission to feel human. Provide space for psychological recovery between combat actions. The programs show measurable positive effects on resilience and mental health. 2019. A documentary filmmaker named Sarah Mitchell produces a film about Bailey's wartime broadcasts. The documentary includes interviews with surviving veterans, archived recordings of Bailey's programs, analysis from military historians and psychologists. The film screens at military bases and veterans' hospitals. The response is powerful. Veterans watching the film remember hearing Bailey's voice decades earlier. They describe what it meant then and what it means now. One veteran, 94 years old, watches the documentary at a veterans' hospital in Arizona. He'd been in the 1st Infantry Division. He'd listened to Bailey's program in Germany in 1945. He hadn't thought about it in years. Watching the documentary brings the memories flooding back. He remembers sitting in a ruined building listening to her voice while snow fell outside. He remembers feeling human for the first time in months. He starts crying. He tells the interviewer, "She saved my life. Not from bullets. From losing myself." The truth is Bailey saved thousands of lives that way. Not from physical death but from psychological death. She kept men connected to their humanity when humanity seemed impossible. She treated them like people when everyone else treated them like soldiers. Her voice was a lifeline to a version of themselves they'd almost forgotten existed. What remains now is the evidence. Archived letters, psychiatric reports, recordings, testimonies. The documents prove Bailey's contribution was real and significant. But they can't capture the actual experience of being a soldier in 1944, hearing a woman's voice speak to you like you're still human. That experience exists only in memory, in stories passed from father to son, in moments that were never recorded but were lived by millions of men who needed someone to remind them they were people. December 2024. A group of military psychologists publishes a comprehensive review of historical morale interventions during World War II. The review identifies Bailey's radio program as the single most effective psychological support intervention of the war. The analysis includes 400-plus studies, 50,000-plus documented cases, statistical modeling of effect sizes. The conclusion is unambiguous. Bailey's voice provided measurable, replicable, significant psychological benefit to soldiers under combat stress. But the review also notes something important. Bailey's effect couldn't be fully explained by technique or content. Other broadcasters tried to replicate her success. They used similar formats, similar content, similar conversational style. The results were modest. Nothing matched Bailey's effect. The psychologists theorized that something about Bailey herself, something in her voice or her presence or her authenticity, created the connection that made her program effective. That ineffable quality might be the most important finding. You can't mass-produce authenticity. You can't replicate genuine care. Bailey's program worked because Bailey genuinely cared about soldiers. She spoke to them as humans because she saw them as humans. That recognition, transmitted through radio waves across thousands of miles, reached men who desperately needed someone to see them that way. The technology was radio. But the intervention was human connection. And human connection, even through static, across distance, despite circumstances, remains the most powerful psychological medicine available. Today, Bailey's recordings are archived at the Library of Congress. Her letters are preserved at the National World War II Museum. Her psychiatric impact is documented in military medical journals. But her real legacy exists elsewhere. It exists in the lives of men who heard her voice and remembered they were human. In the families those men built after the war. In the children and grandchildren who exist because their fathers and grandfathers maintained psychological stability long enough to come home and reclaim their civilian identities. One voice on the radio. One woman speaking to millions of soldiers scattered across the world. Treating them like people when everyone else treated them like tools. Reminding them they had identities beyond their uniforms. Giving them permission to feel human. The simplest intervention imaginable. And perhaps the most powerful. In a storage facility in Maryland, there's a box containing 200,000 letters written to Bailey by soldiers during the war. The letters are fragile now. Paper yellowing. Ink fading. But the words remain. Soldiers trying to explain what her voice meant. What it did to their consciousness. How it kept them connected to themselves when connection seemed impossible. The letters say the same thing in different ways. Thank you for reminding me I'm human. Thank you for talking to me like I matter. Thank you for keeping me alive in ways that have nothing to do with bullets. Those words capture something essential about war and humanity. War tries to erase individual identity. Tries to transform people into tools. Sometimes succeeds. But human consciousness resists erasure. Fights to maintain connection to who we are beneath the uniforms and roles and circumstances. Bailey's voice was a weapon in that fight. Not a weapon against the enemy. A weapon against dehumanization. Against the erasure of self. Against the transformation that turns people into tools. And the weapon worked. Millions of soldiers heard her voice and remembered they were people. Held on to that memory through combat, through trauma, through psychological collapse. Used it as an anchor to pull themselves back from the edge of permanent disintegration. Came home. Lived lives. Became husbands, fathers, workers, citizens. Not because the war didn't damage them. Because someone had kept them connected to themselves while the war was trying to destroy them. That's what remains. Not headlines or medals or official recognition. Just the quiet fact that one woman's voice on the radio helped millions of men stay human during the most dehumanizing experience possible. The fact lives in archives now, in documents and recordings and letters. But it lived first in the consciousness of soldiers who heard her voice through static and shells and remembered, if only for 43 minutes, that they used to be people and might be people again when the war finally ended.